Oh, awesome. Okay, good. That's always good. That's always good stuff. All right, it's 4:01. It's the end of the day. It's Friday. Let's talk about security issues of personal medical devices. All right. I'm sorry. I can't wait. These people are going to want to go. So this is security issues of personal medical devices. I'm not Michele Warner, and I work for ANYCon. So my interest in this topic started over 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, when a friend of mine had a cardiac monitor and a defibrillator implanted. So since we both practice martial arts together, and he also runs his own business, I thought he would have to quit martial arts, and he was an awesome sparring partner, and he'd have to retire and kind of just take it easy. But he said, nope, I'm going to continue my normal life, thanks to this device, which he'll have to carry with him the rest of his life. And true to his word, he and I continue to work towards our black belts, and he's still running his business. He's lost a lot of weight too. But this made me start to wonder, it's like, how are these devices programmed, and how are they updated, and how are they maintained, and how secure are they? I'm sure that you're here probably for the same reason, because you have this curiosity. So I started to look at these devices in the same way that we at NICETech look at other systems for our clients, and with the goal of helping people to make informed decisions about how to use this technology. So, and I dragged my colleague Michele into this.
Hi, I'm Michele. I am an attorney, although as my avatar is telling you, I'm not acting as an attorney while I'm here. I got interested because Todd was talking to me about his master's thesis, and I started going, there's all these people walking around with these devices inside of them, collecting data. What is it being collected? Does everybody know everything being collected? What are they revealing about themselves? Got me thinking about the privacy concerns connected to these medical devices.
So today I want to talk about personal medical devices, so I'm going to call them PMDs, because that and, what's the other term?
ICDs.
Yeah, ICDs. So it's a nice way of collapsing a lot of words. I'm going to call them PMDs. PMDs really encompass all aspects of security and privacy in one package, and I find them fascinating. The technologies and the treatments and the legal aspects for these things are evolving really rapidly, and we as security professionals, we've been really challenged to keep up. Just as an example, several new types of devices were launched earlier this year, and just this last Wednesday, NIST released guidance on security guidance for insulin pumps, which is something that I really want to get to, and I haven't had the chance to get to that yet. So we're going to talk about devices and patients, regulations, vulnerabilities. We'll get into some overall details of attacks and some threat scenarios, and we'll wrap up with some trends. We'll try to get everybody out of here in a reasonable amount of time, because I know everyone's been here all day. But if you do have questions, if you want to follow up, please do after the presentation. So who's at risk? Well, patients and organizations. Patients have the devices, and patients are members of organizations. The numbers are really difficult to kind of suss out, but by one estimate, you can look at it as over 6 million people in the US could be using personal medical devices. So if you think about it, there's about 3 million Americans that have had a pacemaker implanted by 2009. About 1 million people around the world use insulin pumps, with most of those people in the US. And about 2.2 million people have some type of seizure disorder and have difficulty treating their condition to medication, so it requires the use of some type of device to assist them with managing that. And there are other kinds of devices too, such as cochlear implants, which I won't talk about today, but they're also in use. And I don't have numbers handy on them. If you think about it, that's quite a large number of people that can be using these. So what are the risks? Just in general, you think about the data, the device, and their presence. So PMDs collect sensitive data about their usage, and actually the device itself can be a kind of sensitive data. People really don't want to reveal, for various reasons, the fact that they're using these devices. The devices themselves are vulnerable to both adversarial and non-adversarial threats. So people acting deliberately to try to break into the device, and acts of nature and other actions that are not attributable necessarily to a person, but still present a threat to the user. And then the devices themselves have a growing presence in society. So what are personal medical devices? They are, I like to think of them at least, as electronic devices that can be divided into two kinds of categories. So there's stuff that goes in your body and stuff that goes on your body, or implanted and wearable. There are many types of devices that we can talk about, but today I really just want to focus on mostly implantable, like implantable cardiac defibrillators and insulin pumps, because they're two of the most common devices. But if you think about it, all devices really share some common aspects, and we'll cover those. So this is a schematic of where a typical ICD is placed within the body. An implanted medical device that deals, actually, an implanted device that works neurologically or cardiovascularly is placed in this position as well. So implantable devices are designed to be housed inside a patient's body, and they are there for an extended period of time. They're not really intended to be removed. A patient will periodically undergo a minor operation to service the unit or the leads or to replace batteries as well. And that usually happens every 5 to 7 years. So Michele suggested that I include examples of implanted devices, so I'll just list a few here. There's actual pacemakers, which maintain heart rhythm. There are cardiac resynchronization therapy devices to synchronize heart chambers. Okay, here's the big one. Implantable cardioverter defibrillators. Yeah, nailed it. Which monitor...
4 more times.
There'll be a few more times here in the presentation. Which monitor heart rhythm. They can also act as a pacemaker or as a defibrillator as needed. There are cardiac monitors, and these can be used to investigate issues such as epilepsy or fainting spells. And there are even devices that are used to prep patients for other things like heart transplants. So there's something called a left ventricular assist device, which actually includes a pump that takes over for not just the beating of the heart, but some of the heart's ability to move blood around the body. So that's just really fascinating stuff, I'm sorry. So this image shows the control unit for an ICD and also a pacemaker and other related devices. They all share a common kind of design factor here. And then there are the leads, and then the actual electrodes themselves. So we're talking about 3 different pieces of equipment because they can be used for different purposes. And this gives you a sense of the size. So one of the things that impressed me is how small these are. And the scale here is actually in centimeters, but if you look at it, this is about 3 American quarters in diameter. Okay, and this X-ray, this is an X-ray of an adult male in his early 50s, and it shows roughly where in the body this is going to be present. So you saw the schematic, but I think this really drills it home. This device lives inside the patient's body. So the actual ICD is under the skin, so it's roughly right about here. And then the leads penetrate the chest cavity, and they are attached to the heart muscle. It's not coming out. Let's talk about wearable devices. So just in general, we'll have the example here of insulin pumps, which are extremely common. There are many different types of insulin pumps. So up the bottom here is one common type. We have a large separate unit, and this is large because it holds insulin, and it also holds the computer that is used to dispense the medication. And then the actual medication is dispensed through this infusion set right here, which is attached to the patient's body. There are smaller units up here. This has a smaller reservoir, but it's even less intrusive and allows the patient even more mobility. So these are the kinds of things where, again, I have a martial arts background, so I've done some sparring with people, light sparring with people who've worn insulin pumps. There's a lot of mobility. They wear them throughout the day, and they really don't have to, it allows them to move around and not worry about doing injections at intervals throughout the day. It's a life-enabling device. So when you think about something like an insulin pump or something that's on the outside of the body, how does that interface? So I love this diagram. This actually shows, here's the control device we saw just a slide ago, and this connects to the infusion set. So this is actually passing medication. And it doesn't have to be insulin, it could be another type of medication. It goes into this infusion set, and then in this infusion set, there's a small needle that fits. Here's some skin, and this goes underneath the skin into the squishy bits. So right about here, and it drips medication in, and then that's absorbed by the body. So as you, and then the next one is a sensor. So sometimes PMDs are just sensors, and a sensor helps not just the doctor, but also the patient really manage their condition. So someone who's a diabetic needs to be aware of their blood glucose levels throughout the day. And this device here also has a small needle that sits in the skin and senses body chemistry. If you think about it, this device can also be used for other types of monitoring. So, and for different types of health conditions, but they're very commonly used for glucose monitoring. They're called CGMs. And this actually talks to a smartphone. So patients love these because it allows them to look at their glucose levels throughout the day, and then they can think about, what was I doing at this point in time when my glucose, when I felt tired, I noticed my glucose level was low. And it really helps patients kind of take control of their conditions. Actually, so you're probably thinking, if you're like me, well, why don't they just take the glucose monitor and then hook that up to the glucose, the insulin pump? Why don't they do that? Well, actually they have, and it's called a closed loop system, or marketing terms call it an artificial pancreas. And there's a device that came on the market about 6 to 8 months ago that enables people who are diabetic to function throughout their day without having to worry about really what their glucose level is. They don't have to test themselves, and they also don't have to inject themselves because it's being done automatically to adjust for what they're doing. Other types of wearable devices, so this is an epilepsy monitor. This is something that my colleague, Michele, brought to my attention. I wasn't aware of this, but these actually sense, this is kind of like a smartwatch. Actually, it is a kind of smartwatch. And it sits on your skin, it monitors the electrical activity on your skin. And this is used for convulsive, any kind of seizure disorder. So what this does is it interfaces with your phone, and if it detects you're having a seizure, if someone's having a severe seizure, they're usually non-responsive. They usually can wind up in a dangerous situation. So this will pair up with your phone and notify anyone you want, caregiver, and also provide your location so they can come and get you. So to kind of sum up, PMDs, they have a common design. If you think about them in terms of multiple segments, so there's a control unit, there are sensors that receive information about the body, and then there's a machine-body interface. So if it's not just a sensor, then it's doing something to your body. It's dispensing medication or some kind of therapeutic measure. They're designed for long-term use, so they can operate up to several years without intervention. They have pretty considerable computing power. If you think about it, they have to adapt to patient health conditions. They have to update therapies on the fly, perform different actions based on what they're sensing is going on with the patient's body. They also collect data for treatment and for later download and study. So some researchers compare the complexity of these devices to be on par with aircraft avionics systems, nuclear power plant control systems. And if you think about it, it really doesn't make a lot of sense. It's very, very difficult, of course, if you do any programming, to try to program for every single contingency, especially when someone's life is on the line, like they are with these devices. It can get really complex. And of course, they all have some form of wireless communication to share data, to get updates, that kind of thing. All right, so who uses PMDs? So I already talked about my friend, and this is actually pretty surprising. The more I dug into this, the more I realized that a lot of people use these devices. So one trend is that they're just being used, especially for ICDs, they're being used more and more frequently. I didn't realize that the first devices were implantable devices, implantable cardiac devices, came about in the late 60s. Pacemakers were approved for Medicare reimbursement at that point, and at the time there were 56 heart conditions that they were approved for. By 2008, that list had increased to 88, And today, there's even more potential uses for these devices, especially when you start looking at things like treating Parkinson's disease. About 16% of devices are used by people under the age of 65, so it's a pretty good amount of people who are using implantable devices in the workforce. About 1 million people around the world use insulin pumps, as I mentioned before. Since the most common users of PMDs are currently cardiac patients and diabetics, I'll focus on the cardiac patients here just to give you some illustration. Here's the face of someone who has an ICD. She's in her 20s. Her name is Shoshana Davis, and she's a magazine writer. In her first article to discuss her treatment, she said that while I'm not the only person under 65 with a pacemaker, it is rare, and to most security officers, like the TSA, she's the only one they've ever seen. This is really interesting. This is Marie Moe. I don't know if anybody here has met her or knows her, but she's a security researcher who herself has a pacemaker, and she's written about that. She actually does research into pacemakers and ICDs and the security threats that exist for those devices. She describes her age as being younger than most pacemaker patients. So as you can see, she is still fairly young. One of the things that Marie wrote about when she had her device implanted was, the doctor tells you you're going to have a device implanted, and then you go and you have an operation to have it done. So you don't really have a lot of discussion around this. But afterwards, she had a lot of questions, which the doctor really didn't have answers to. And you can probably imagine what she was asking him. So just to sum up about patients, so there's a significant number of patients of working age. Patients are physically active, and they hold key roles at work, so that's something as people who work with organizations that assess security risks we need to be aware of. And using a PMD is not a lifestyle choice. These patients are really rely on these devices to maintain their life and manage the treatment. So if they work in a key role, if they have to be in a secure area, they can get rid of their cell phone and shut that off, but they really can't do anything about their PMD. They have to have it. There are also legal aspects of personal devices, so I'm going to let...
My turn?
Yes. Michele, take over.
So normally Todd and I go back and forth in our presentations a lot.
There's a lot more banter.
Yeah, this time I'm just the magician's assistant. He's going to go transform into a butterfly. So I think we all understand the importance of these devices and how they've benefited society. People have a lot more mobility, more freedom of movement. They allow parents or caregivers to detect a seizure longer before it happens. Usually you don't get any warning. The person just falls over and you have to respond, and it can be a very difficult situation. But what are some of the legal aspects of these? The use of PMDs, their data, and the research surrounding the PMD capabilities are all regulated by the federal government. Researchers must obviously follow strict rules, such as carrying out research in a controlled environment, and to research only in the areas outlined by the law. So how are they regulated? So the FDA, obvious one, they usually do the approvals for the devices, just like they do for drugs. They continue to develop guidance surrounding the cybersecurity connected to the devices. Their first one released in 2013, their initial guidance based itself on NIST. I'm sure that's a term everybody's familiar with here. They actually, and as Todd mentioned, NIST itself just released insulin pump specific guidance recently. So there's also the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which protect medical devices and makes it illegal to circumvent their copyright protections and access controls. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the CFAA, it prohibits accessing a computer without permission. And these are, in fact, little computers buried inside of you. There's also the FTC that put in an exemption in 2015 to allow investigators to get into them without a problem. 21 CFR 803. That is the medical device reporting regulation. It requires manufacturers to report serious injury, death, the FDA. There's also, I'm sure many of you have heard of it, the GDPR. If you're in the UK or the EU, that would be a big impact here because it's data collection. California's new law would probably be covered with these. HIPAA, I'm sure we all know that one. This is in fact PHI. It's used for doctors to watch their patients. So one of the cases that we would like to discuss is Brasel versus Medtronic. How liable are these manufacturers if something goes wrong with the PMD? The answer to that is that depends. This case,
Which is what we expected to say, I think.
I am a lawyer. This case indicated that if a device has been pre-market approved by the FDA, you cannot bring a case. This is based on the Medical Device Amendment Act of 1976 that bars court cases where the FDA had given pre-market approval. This is because the FDA undertakes an extensive research of the product before they give that market approval. Once a manufacturer has that approval, they cannot change anything about the device, its marketing, its schematics, anything without further going through the process. And they spend at least 1,200 hours per device. This doesn't mean that you can't bring a case. You just can't bring it under this if it's been pre-market approved. You can get damages under the NDA, and there's more acronyms, for claims where you say that it violated FDA regulations. So many people believe that this case may have had an important impact into how manufacturers treat the vulnerabilities. We don't know for sure because so many of these are on the cutting edge that the law and court cases just haven't caught up.
Thanks, Michelle. All right,
Are you a butterfly yet?
I don't think so. I think this would be a good time to delve into vulnerabilities of PMDs, and I think that's why everybody's really pure. So, next slide, there we go. So let's talk about vulnerabilities. One centers around, or several center around data. PMDs collect patient-specific health information and information. It includes, as an example, patient electromyography. So if you have an ICD, you're going to see this data, which is, electromyography is how well a patient's heart is responding to nerve signals. You're also going to see things like device responses to arrhythmia. Some devices that have been examined by researchers under laboratory conditions contain and will transmit, if interrogated, data such as name of the patient, patient's date of birth, name and phone number of the treating physician, dates of implantation of the ICD and the leads, the model number, the serial number, and other information about the device, like where is it implanted in the body, what conditions is it used to be treated for.
Ding, 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 PHI?
Yeah, so this has a lot to do with PHI, obviously. And until recently, this data on the device itself has not been encrypted. I'm trying to think of what else. I think that pretty much covers it. Oh yeah, information about the patient, doctor, device specific information.
Maybe they should have to do SSPs for these devices.
You know, that's not a bad idea. Communication capabilities. So usually there's, so we saw some pictures of the devices and they are pretty small and they have limited range with the communication. So they usually buddy up with another unit. It might be a separate base station, or more commonly now it's going to be the patient's cell phone. So this base station or phone is going to receive data from the medical device itself, and then it's going to transmit that data to the care provider or actually to something in the cloud. There are 4 common wireless frequencies that are used by these devices. The typical effective communication range, regardless of frequency, is about 10 meters, about 30 feet. And that would be for something like an ICD or for an insulin pump or something like that. So for smaller, more limited devices like the CGM sensor, that glucose monitoring sensor that you saw earlier, that's going to have a range of about 2 inches to about 6 feet, depending on the capabilities of the unit, unless it's using Bluetooth, in which case it's going to have more of a typical Bluetooth range. The FCC makes a lot of this information about the devices publicly available. Other details like the radio frequencies that are used and information about how the devices communicate is often available in device manuals, and you can download that information from the manufacturer. So one of the things I was able to determine, just based on reading articles about other researchers and what they've done security-wise, so the older devices use the 175 kilohertz band. There's a medical implant communication services band, which is between 402 and 405 megahertz. So the old ones will use 175. The newer ones will use 900 megahertz or the 402, 405 megahertz frequencies. And the very, very latest ones tend to use Bluetooth. And I think that most devices, off the top of my head, manufactured in the past 2 years, typically use Bluetooth or are Bluetooth capable.
Are any of those more risky than the others?
We'll get to that. Okay. So, I hate to hold you in suspense, usually I just like to give you the answer, but we're going to get to that. So logging and forensics. So looking at this, again, from a defender's point of view, what information about access and usage is logged on the device? How do we investigate a hack or the suspicion of malicious behavior? So cryptographic audit logs and protection for the log information collected by the devices generally hasn't been available. So they just don't collect this kind of information. Until recently, they've started to do this. They've also begun to, some manufacturers have begun to implement cryptographic protections as well. One device I was looking at recently, in the marketing literature, it said that the data on the device is protected through encryption, but it didn't give any details on what that encryption is. Some researchers additionally have proposed forensic procedures to follow. So they've done, people are looking at how do we forensically investigate these devices. If you can imagine, if you've done any forensic work, you've taken a computer, you've frozen it, and you address it using a certain set of procedures to ensure that evidence is preserved. You really don't yet have a solid set of procedures to follow when investigating an attack or suspected attack in a medical device. If you can imagine why, one of the problems is it might be inside someone, and that person might still be alive. And we really can't mess around with the device because that could affect their own health. But if you're interested, I do have some links, and there are some papers available which propose some information about that. So in terms of access, I mentioned that access really isn't logged. This is kind of cool. So information and maintenance procedures for medical devices really lag behind technology. So the way that it used to be, you went in for an operation, the sales rep, hospitals really don't maintain inventories of these things. So the sales rep would show up and go into the operating room with your doctor. They would implant the device, and the sales rep would do the initial programming. And then sometime later, a few weeks later, you'd go in and have the device updated. And the way you did that was it was through contact. So they actually have a head with a magnet on it that would trigger the device, and you could program it that way. So you had to be in contact. It would take a magnet of about 700 Gauss, which is like one of those rare earth magnets that are about the size of a dime. Something just enough to penetrate the skin through about an inch. But procedures really haven't changed since then. So a lot of work of researchers have determined that these devices really don't have any access protection. Scott Urban, as a researcher, said that he looked at a couple of defibrillator vendors. They use a Bluetooth stack, and they were only protected by a pin. A very simple pin, and that pin was pretty much specific to the manufacturer. Other researchers have found that communication with ICDs and other types of wearable devices can be initiated through the use of open source software. And through, a combination of a software-defined radio dongle and something like GNU Radio, they were able to reverse engineer the communication for their device. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there are known vulnerabilities related to authorization. There are a few CVEs that are out there. Some units, like Medtronic units, these vulnerabilities are based on things like hard-coded passwords being present in the device software, or debugging code that's still present in production units. And in one case, the debugging code actually provided the ability to read and write arbitrary memory values through the use of wireless protocols. So common vulnerabilities, just to kind of sum up, wireless connectivity is an issue, weak or no authentication is an issue, limited or no logging and forensic support is an issue, and the ability to store and transmit sensitive data, often unencrypted, is an issue. So I know what you're thinking, but To date, there have been no known attacks in the wild on any of these devices, unless something's popped up in the past couple months. I haven't heard. But it's not all bad news. But before I get to the good news, I'll do more bad news. So let's look at some of the attacks that have been demonstrated by security researchers. And just remember that there have been no known attacks. So if you or someone you know has one of these devices, I don't want you going out if you're in a panic. So the time frame is pretty much up to 2008 and after 2008. So before 2008, the main weaknesses associated with PMDs involved non-adversarial issues. So 60% of the problems were hardware issues, and 40% were software problems. I'm losing my voice after a full day here.
Because you talk too much.
I talk too much. At least I don't talk as much as an attorney does.
You talk more.
I do go to law school for a day, so we'll talk about that later. Some reason, it's simply due to the complexity of connecting computing devices to human beings. I mean, if you think about it, they started implanting, we're really working on these things in the late 60s. By 2008, they worked out a lot of the bugs, but defects still remain. After 2008, PMDs with wireless capabilities really arrived on the market, and that's when we started seeing people looking more at the wireless capabilities for weaknesses. So 2008, so I think everybody, let's think back to 2008, just the context. Iron Man, the first Iron Man came out. GPS makes its way into the first kind of commercial devices. So this is 10 years ago, this is way back. USB 3.0 was introduced in 2008. I'd forgotten about that. So this first attack that was demonstrated was done by researchers. They'd taken an FDA-approved implantable cardiac defibrillator, put it into lab conditions, and they were following the regulations that Michele had talked about earlier. And they used a software-defined radio device and open source software, so they got something able to use commercial off-the-shelf hardware. Open source software. They intercepted data logged by the IND, and they were able to take that, reverse engineer the protocol, and control how the device delivered electric shocks to a simulated heart. And this was the first known attack of its kind. So 2010 to 2015, more advances in culture and science. This is Barnaby Jack, by the way. He's a very handsome looking guy. I had no idea he looked that good. So something to aspire to as a security person. So in this period, researchers begin to examine wireless communication, and they intercept communication between those insulin pumps, the external pumps, and the base units. And they were able to purposefully modify the therapeutic programming of those devices. So they're able to reverse engineer the communication and tell the device to go outside its original protocol, dispensing either more or less insulin than it was designed to do, or programmed to do. They were also able to do this by, again, going into manufacturers' websites, getting information and finding information about the devices through publicly available information. Jay Radcliffe, who is a diabetic and also a hacker, he reverse engineered the communication protocol for his own insulin pump. I don't recommend you doing this, but he was able to do it, and he revealed a weakness that also involves other insulin pumps that would allow attackers to wirelessly control those pumps. So Barnaby Jack looked at insulin pumps and also at implantable devices. So again, he looked at controlling pumps through its wireless interface. And looking at a pacemaker, he demonstrated, I think it was at a Black Hat, through how to control the pacemaker through its wireless interface and order the pacemaker to deliver shocks. He also discovered that these pacemakers, when interrogated the proper way, will provide credentials that someone can use. So you transmit a command to the pacemaker gives you credentials back, and this is all done wirelessly, and then those credentials can be used to take over that pacemaker and control it. Additionally, other researchers, while investigating how to conduct forensic investigations, as I mentioned before, same people, they explored the feasibility of using brute force and replay attacks against the authentication used for pacemakers. They discovered that In a certain model of pacemaker, the exchange of data, the sensitive data, so they ask the pacemaker to download data to their device. That download was actually done in the clear or through, in some cases, through weakly encrypted communication. And the devices did not actually try to determine if any connections made to them were legitimate connections. They simply accepted it and responded to the connection. 2015 to 2018, now we're getting into our present time. There's additional research. We're starting to see research accelerate as people become more aware of the weaknesses present in these devices, and we get more and more devices out there. Researchers who are also patients, right, like Jeremy Radcliffe and Marie Moe, are becoming more vocal about this. There's more research centered coming from them. But they're all stymied because these devices are really closed in nature, so these aren't open devices. Devices with GPS capabilities also come on the scene and they start being involved in data breaches. This is a screen capture, Strava. I think everybody should be aware of this one, where Fitbits and fitness devices, people are uploading the information to Strava, and then that information is being used to determine people's habits, exercise habits, and the location of things that should not be disclosed. There are new adversarial attacks, devices that have, and these are centered around neurological devices. So there are implants used for Parkinson's disease, which are monitoring and reacting to people's brain wave patterns and administering electric shocks to help them manage tremors and other symptoms. So what's discovered here is that there are certain types of brain waves being monitored that can actually be used as a kind of side channel attack. So if someone breaks into this device, they can see that, they can tell when someone is recognizing something that's before them, like information or a person. So it's a kind of side channel attack. And there are also non-adversarial threats emerging. These devices are really susceptible to EMF. Or in one case, a woman who has an implant for treatment of dystonia, which is a kind of tremor. Her apartment building was hit by lightning, which took out some of her appliances. And even though her implant wasn't connected to anything directly, the electromagnetic pulse generated by the lightning strike caused her device to reset and go to safe mode. So again, as a defender, these are all things that we have to be aware of and think about the environment that the person is in. So I put together a list of some possible vectors. So I'm looking at all of the attacks, and there are other attacks that I haven't mentioned here that I've found in the past few years. But really, things like a replay attack, man-in-the-middle attack, denial of service, or DOS attack is interesting. You can cause a device to go into a diagnostic mode where all it does is it just runs diagnostics all the time and wears the battery down. There's all kinds of things you can do to these devices. Social engineering. So you can get information about the device. You can use that information as a spear phishing attack against the patient. There's reverse engineering of the software. From a non-adversarial perspective, there's EM interference and interference with other things like magnetism. You'll notice that there's a lot of similarity here with mobile computing. And I kind of, from a security perspective, I kind of think about these things as, what if I had an Apple Watch implanted in my body that was active? How would that make me vulnerable? Or make the organization I belong to vulnerable? Kind of running a little short on time, so I'm almost done. In terms of attacks or threat scenarios, there's a lot of adversarial scenarios you could think of. I mentioned spear phishing. Extortion is obvious, and I think we've seen enough spy movies where we don't have to go into that one. Reconnaissance is kind of interesting. One of the things I wasn't aware of, but I was speaking with some other hackers, since these are essentially mobile devices that have wireless interfaces, you can use them to track people's movements through buildings and things like that. It's kind of interesting. And of course, there are many ways of doing bodily harm. Michele pointed out that fingerprinting.
This is my favorite one, if you really have a favorite out of these, because it's not just collecting the health data that you think about, it's tracking your movements, it's tracking your activities. So if your heart rate accelerates, maybe you're exercising, maybe you're having sex. Fitbit can detect that based on your activity levels. If you have to inject insulin, it's maybe because you had a really large meal, and then they can track based on your location where you might have eaten. And based on all of these, they can data mine and create patterns and use it, A, social engineering, they can use it to gain even more about you.
And it's really hard to deny that it's not you if they know that if you're wearing a device that will tell them who you are and who your doctor is when they ask you to. In terms of non-adversarial attacks, device configuration and misconfiguration is a big issue. If you think about, let's say you have a key employee, a CTO, CEO, someone in your company, their device has been misconfigured in some way so that when they encounter a certain situation, they're having a stressful day and they become catatonic, or suddenly they hit the ground because their defibrillator kicked in. These are things that can be a security risk for your organization. Device malfunction. There isn't a lot of data published on this. Manufacturers really don't like to share it. One of the studies that I found was actually from the 1980s. And there was actually a 25% failure rate of infusion pumps back in the 80s. I'm sure, I hope they've gotten a lot better and more reliable now. Loss of support infrastructure. Sometimes the manufacturers go out of business or they simply stop supporting the devices. This has happened most notably with some types of insulin pumps. The last manufacturer, Medtronic, was the last manufacturer to support a certain model of insulin pump. And the people left in the US have to actually go to France to have their devices taken care of and maintained. Interference is also another thing. These devices are susceptible to electromagnetic fields. Even some type of physical contact can sometimes disrupt the device. All right. So just talking about what's next, and wrapping up now. Thank you. You guys are being really patient too, especially at the end of the day. There are some trends that we've been thinking about. Really the biggest trend is pointing to the increasing use of devices, both for medical reasons and economic reasons. There are new applications being developed for existing sensors, such as the Fitbit, because you can use that by patients to manage chronic conditions if you program it in a certain way, or have it set up in a certain way. And also by the general population, you can use it to monitor health. In some cases, the use of wearable devices like the Fitbit is being encouraged by health insurance companies as a way to gather data about the people that use them and to encourage healthy living, hopefully to lower cost of healthcare. The people who use the devices get kickback. And something else I find really fascinating, prosthetic devices. So I think this is another area where we're going to see microprocessors and sensors being used. They're essentially robotic devices that help patients move around and interact with their environment in a natural way. If you think about hands, replacement hands that can grip and provide sensory feedback to the user, replacement legs that have gyroscopes and that help patients balance and move naturally. All of these things are going to have additional wireless capabilities because they will have to be programmed in a convenient way, and data will have to be collected about how well they're performing. Another big issue coming up is privacy. I know that's a big thing for Michele.
So in attorney time, the type of information that could be impacted by a breach of these devices is also changing as they're starting to get more and more complicated, collecting different types of information. Today, these devices reveal a person's health, but they're also now developing devices to tell when a person is looking at something. They monitor brain activity to see what they're looking at. Does it make you excited? Does it trigger certain spots of the brain? What could you be looking at? And then a reminder that privacy law is still catching up. GDPR only really went into effect this year, and that was groundbreaking. These modern medical marvels just are way ahead of our time, at least in privacy law.
Well, that's what we're seeing in other areas of technology too, is that legal stuff just tends to lag technological advancement. It's just kind of the way it goes. So, those are good points. So, wrapping up, there are three unique qualities of personal medical devices that I think are a real challenge for people in security. There's the ability to wirelessly connect with other devices, and that ability to connect is outside of the patient's control sometimes, almost always. The collection of protected health information is a big thing. And then the integral role that these devices play in the health of the patient. So these are all ways that they challenge us as professionals to manage security for them and for the organizations they belong to. On the positive side, you want to end on a positive note, There's growing recognitions that the vulnerabilities that exist in these devices have to be addressed. And we're seeing a lot more research in these areas. We're seeing a lot more press coverage and awareness of it, so that's great. Companies, manufacturers are beginning to address these issues. We're starting to see encryption on devices. And researchers continue to explore their attack surface. And of course, the legal community is looking at regulations that are related to device usage to protect users as well. Almost out of time, so are there any questions? Yes.
Yeah, could you offer some additional information on the regulations about how we can get access to the devices to do testing and actually accessing firmware, reverse engineering, that kind of thing? Like, without that community presence, it seems really hard to address the vulnerabilities. And if there's regulations in the way, like what can we do to?
Well, so one of the biggest regulations that's going to be in the way is HIPAA, because it's PHI, it's very protected information, so you're not going to be able to necessarily get access to a patient's information. I can't speak to the devices fully.
Usually what happens is they acquire a device and then they set it up in some kind of lab situation. So there are guidelines, and we can, if you get in touch with us afterwards, we can provide you with guidelines about those. Generally you have to use, you just follow, I'm trying to blank right now, but it's fairly simple guidelines to follow. You have to share the information. You have to be able to. You have to be doing this for. You have to be on the up and up. So you have to do this for nefarious purposes. You also have to. Just come up afterwards. We'll discuss.
One of my favorite examples that you told me about when we were talking earlier is when they're doing these, what you're talking about, trying to attack it. They stick it in meat to try to simulate the human body, and I just find that really funny.
Well, not always, but they'll
in a
just,
pig in a lab.
I think it was a roast actually. So the question was, what are the rules around this? How do you find out more information? I have some more information. You come back afterwards. I can give you the references and talk about that. That's a great question. So, anybody else? Yes, sir.
You said that there's known vulnerabilities that they found for these sorts of things. I would hope that they corrected those vulnerabilities and produced a patch or something along those lines. How are those sorts of updates and patches applied to all these devices?
So how are updates and patches applied to devices? Those usually come from the manufacturer. They are typically done in the doctor's office because they're not quite sure. They want to ensure that nothing bad happens when they make the update. So updates happen slowly. So I have the CVE numbers. I have a couple CVE numbers. If you're interested, you can look them up and fall down the same rabbit hole that I did.
So is that something that they should probably work on getting quicker? Because I mean, as soon as a vulnerability is made public by a CVE, it's one matter of time before someone finds a way to exploit that and leverage it. So it should.
I agree with you, although there's a human element here. I mean, doctors' offices themselves, I'm sure that sometimes it takes months to even get into a doctor's office. So I think it's just a matter of.
I think it's a good point. And to be honest with you, I haven't looked into that myself. I don't know what the response rate is, or how quickly someone can have a patch applied. So it's a good point. Sorry, I don't have an answer for you, but yeah. Anyone else? I hope this was really helpful for you. This is a fascinating area for me. I hope I wasn't wrong on anything, but I'm sure there are things that I overlooked and stated incorrectly. Michele, of course, is always right. I don't argue with her. So thank you very much, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.